welcome to another video. This video is about some remarks that were made by Dr. Majak recently. It was an event that was organized by the Tree East Youth Association and Tree East Community Association to honor one of their own. It was Arok. He was a former chairman of Tree East Youth Association. So he has been appointed by President Kiir as an undersecretary in the Ministry of Information. So Majak was making these remarks, and his capacity as an elder in the community is someone who is well known, so he was giving words of encouragement. Some of the things he has said are things with which many people have disagreed. But what I want to say here is, what are some of the things he said and things he didn't say? Because people are saying things that he didn't say, but there are some things that are problematic in what he said, although he doesn't see them that way. That's the issue. So his advice was coming from a good place. It was well-intentioned. It was coming from a place of an elder, an intellectual advising future leaders or current leaders who are somehow taking over. Now, here's what I want to emphasize. He did not say that the Red Army generation is more corrupt than the SPLA generation. That is one of the things people are talking about, because those of you who do not understand the Jiang language, and then you took the statement from what has been translated and then posted as somehow a meme. People are sharing that and commenting from that perspective, that he said the youth, because in South Sudan, people who are under the age of 50 are referred to as youth, but that's the reality of the issues in South Sudan. But he didn't say they were more corrupt. I usually call them the Red Army generation, because this is a generation that most of them did not fight. Some of them did fight, but most of them did not fight. So this is a generation that was born in the late 1970s and the 1980s and 1990s. So late 1970s and below. So you can see those who are born in the late 1970s are not youth. They're approaching their 50s. But that's how people see them. They still see them as youth. That's why you see in South Sudan there's such a thing as senior youth. But from what he has said, some people are making inferences and some people are making extrapolations as to what he has said and what that means. That's what happens when you live in a political charged environment. So people contextualize what has been said in a way that fits their narrative and their political realities. You see this in the West, in Canada, in the US, especially in the US, where the president says something and then different political groups and settings, they take it the way they want to take it because it fits their realities. Now, what did he actually say? This is the first thing he said. The Red Army generation have started on the wrong foot. So he's saying you've been tested already as a generation, as a collective. So what does that mean? It means that the sample of the Red Army generation that has been put in place or was put in place by the president, that were decreed into positions of power as ministers and even as vice president, Bolumel, under secretaries and director generals in different capacities. So he's saying the sample of your generation has been tested. So meaning you are the future, and there's no any other generation that with which will replace you. So he's saying we are on our way out. So you are the future. He's also saying Blue House is full of many of you. He's referencing those of Bolumel, those of Bach, those of former Minister of Finance, and the rest that have been arrested. He actually referenced the case of Nimule as an example of the failure of a generation. Dr. Bach was caught on his way to Nimule, and he was caught with some money. So he's using that as an example of a generational failure. So he's also saying the SPLA generation, his generation, the generation of those of John Garang, Kira Mayadit, Waniga, they will have something to show. For example, the liberation credential. They've liberated the country and then they also brought independence. So that is the achievement of their generation. He's saying the Red Army generation cannot claim that, even if some of them actually did fight in the war, some of them were wounded. But we can still see that's a sample. The majority of the SPLA generation, like myself and people of my generation, is saying you have nothing to show. They can show the liberation credential, they can show the independence, but he's saying, what will you showcase? Bolumel, back running to Nimule and being caught? Who will you show? The rest of who are corrupt? So he's saying it doesn't look good. That's what he's saying. So he's saying the Red Army generation will have a lot to answer for. in terms of performance. He's saying if we look back in the future and say, oh, Majak, what have you done? He's going to say, look, I liberated the country. I fought during the war. The same thing with Kiramayadi. The same thing with Wani. They will say, well, at least we liberated the country, but what will you show? But he did place some caveat. He did say the generation he's referring to as a collective, because I think he contradicts himself. He said, oh, it's a sample, but he said it's a collective. And then he said again, no, he's referring to Jiang, because he's saying the majority of those who have been tested are members of Jiang, even though they are just a sample of Jiang. So he's saying other ethnic groups like the Zande or like the Cholo or others, Acholi, they've not been tested. So he does make that distinction. He knows that these decrees have ethnic dimension. So he does acknowledge that. He also even acknowledged that the Nuer have not been tested enough in terms of the generation because they have not been decreed into position of power. So he does acknowledge that the ethnic dimension of the country. He does reference in this speech people like Lam Tungwar and Dollar, who have not failed yet, but he said that's just a sample. So these are some of the things he's saying. So where do I agree with him? Here's where I agree with him. The question we ask ourselves, and I think that is what he was trying to say, whose corruption and incompetence can destroy the future? The SPLA generation may be corrupt, they may have failed in state building, but as he said, they are on their way out. Now, the Red Army generation and younger is the generation that is coming in. If they also become corrupt and incompetent, then the future of the country is destroyed. So if the Red Army generation and the younger generation look at the corruption and say, look, we don't have to copy what they did, we have to change things, then the future becomes better. But if we behave exactly like the older generation, become tribalistic, become corrupt, make use of incompetent officials running institutions, then the future of the country is more in jeopardy than it is now. But at least we can say, that's what I gather from what he's saying is, at least, even if the older generation has failed, but the new generation looks at things differently, doesn't become corrupt, then I think the future is better. So that's where I agree with him. I agree with the statement. But this is where I think he's wrong, or he may have downplayed some things. He's comparing 40 years of generational performance to less than 5 years of generational performance. The SPLA generation has more than 20 years of liberation experience, and then more than 20 years of Southern autonomy and independence. There's no way you can compare the two. To say this is enough to compare this generation that has been in position of power for 40 years, a few sample who have not been in position of power for that long. So that's unfair. So I think that's a comparison you cannot make as a public intellectual. He's also comparing a whole generation to a tiny sample of untested, perhaps mediocre of a generation. Because if you look at the SPLM leaders, whether you're looking at John Garang, you're looking at those of Riek Machar, Salva Kiir, those of Majak, like Karangathon, Karabina Kwanyin, Nguyen Bany, and the rest were politicians like Oduor, like Martin Majer. These were the best of their generation. So, and they've been tested. To compare that to a sample, yes, there's some of them more qualified, like the former governor of Central Bank, Dr. Alich. Even back, they're qualified. So, but they've not been tested enough. So he's comparing, there's some who are now in positions of power for my generation, but these are not the best of the generation. So that comparison is unfair, in my opinion. He's also overplaying 2 decades of liberation achievement and credentials. And then he is downplaying 2 decades of failed state building. So he's saying, yes, that's the achievement. We cannot take away the liberation credentials. That is always going to be part of history, and that's going to be part of the achievements. That's over 20 years. But we also have 20 years of failed state building. That was not the Red Army generation that was in charge of it. They did not allow the Red Army generation to take over. So other thing that I should have mentioned in the first one is also that the only way you can compare the 2 generations is to say, okay, let us wait for 40 years. And then also let us see that everyone from the president to the vice presidents, to the governors, to the ministers, to everyone in the system making decisions is from the Red Army generation. That's the only time you can compare the two. To say this generation has failed, this generation has not failed, or the SPLA generation has done better than this generation. But The presidency is still with them, everything, the vice presidency, few governors maybe, but the majority are still their generation. The leadership within the SPLM that is making decision is still the old guards. So I think that's where the comparison is also not appropriate. And then the credentials is downplaying failed state building. And then he's also expecting the older generation to be flawed, to accept their flaws as human beings, but expecting the Red Army generation to be angels in a corrupt system? No, they're human beings too. And some of them are in their 50s. They're not getting any younger. So I think it's unfair to expect these people to, oh, they're human beings, they can make mistakes, but these people, you have to be angels. That's not fair. So the other thing is also he's blaming the mentee, but he's providing exculpatory arsenals to the mentor. So he's giving the mentor, the arsenals to say that's not my problem, but he's blaming the one who was mentored by the mentor. There's no way you can say, I do this, but don't do it. It's that kind of say, do what I say, but not what I do. If the mentor is corrupt, if the mentor is tribalistic, if the mentor is failing state building, where is the mentee going to get the mindset about state building? Because he and she is working within the same system that was developed by the mentor. So to make that kind of a distinction is problematic. So they are conjoined in the hip, because if the other one failed, the other one copies. So the other thing that he knows, we criticize our generation. The Red Army generation criticizes itself. We do not valorize Bol Mel when he was making mistakes. We called him out. The same thing, we call ourselves out. Those of gang, we were calling them out. Even I made a video where I was criticizing Alich. Alich is a gentleman. He's not corrupt, but there was something he was part of, the building of the governor's mansion. I have a video on YouTube where I was calling him out. We do that. They don't. They don't criticize themselves. That's why we have a failed state building. What happens when they try to criticize themselves? You know what happens? In 2013, when those of Riek Machar, of Pagan and Majak himself, when they came out and called out the failure of the SPLM, what happened? Hell broke loose. So that's part of our generation that they don't have. So when we look back later on, we can point out at these things and say, this is what we did. We were fenced out of the leadership and then tokenized into position of power and then blamed for failing within a system that was developed for failure, what they call patrimonial system. So the younger generation is also less tribalistic. I know there's some of us who are tribalistic. I know some of my colleagues who are very, very chauvinistic, Gen chauvinist. But I think it's a system that makes them think that way. But the majority, especially the younger one, those who are younger than myself, they are not tribalistic. So the tribalist system now cannot be blamed on anyone else. The war that is there now cannot be blamed on anyone. The failure to implement the peace agreement cannot be blamed on anyone. Where exactly does Dr. Majak expect this younger generation to learn the art of state building, the use of protocols to run institutions as opposed to functionary-centered institution, the big manism that is affecting Africa, the Zol Kabirism? This is something they are learning from the older generation. So what should Dr. Majak do? I think he should acknowledge that his statement is problematic and own it. I don't think he does. I've seen in other fora, he believes he was encouraging the youth, which I think was coming from a good place, but that's not exactly what the statement means. Because we know most of the SPLA generation, they don't apologize. And he did acknowledge, I give him credit. He did say that we need to give them time because they were used to a different system. They were military men. They only took advice from senior officials. But in a system where you have to listen to good counsel, even if it's coming from someone who's junior or younger, they're not used to it. And it would be really difficult for him to sort of say, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Because this statement can be used by the powers that be in Juba to say, oh, see, even those of Majang God who is not in government knows this generation has failed, so we should be careful in terms of giving them positions. That's going to be counterproductive. So I've said this most of the time to SPLM leaders and South Sudanese leaders. If you want to speak from written speeches. It helps you control what you say. But sometimes the SPLM leaders, they don't really care about the consequences of what they say because of traditional hubris or because of cultural hubris. But Majak is different. And I do know that he can own this. He can come out and say, I apologize. because the way he interacts with the younger people is impressive. He's not stuck up. It's not like other leaders who would say, they're too high to exchange views. I know sometimes some younger people, they misuse that, but he's good at that. He does interact with almost anyone, which is a quality of a leader. And that's why I'm making this, because we don't want someone like Majak to turn out to be stuck up and become too arrogant and say, okay, he's highly educated, he's well placed, he has liberation credentials, he worked in government. So he has a lot to show that most of us cannot. He's not like that. But if he says statements like this and doesn't own up to them, then that's a bad sign. And that's also why I'm always critical of Dr. Akola Paul Cody, because I see he has potential, but he's moving towards that kind of SPLM mentality where I say these things, I don't really care how you take it. And the SPLM leaders, they are not answerable to anyone. That's the problem with accountability. They're not accountable to anyone. So we don't want people like Majak. Even if he's not in government, Majak is still younger. He still has a potential to be the president of South Sudan. So that's why we also need to pick on this and see what they mean, not to misconstrue them, but actually rationalize them in the way they were actually said. So don't forget to share the video, like, comment, and also subscribe on Kurti TV YouTube channel. We are moving forward. We are about 500 subscribers to reach 5,000. So thank you.